They thought it was a gift of mercy. Starving men, gorging on sweet dates in the desert heat. But within minutes, they were tearing off their own skin and screaming at invisible monsters. This is the story of the meal that drove an entire expedition to eat each other. The sun is a white hammer, striking the anvil of the earth. There is no shade here, only the blinding glare of the Gar. A hand claws at the burning sand. The skin is blackened like old parchment, and the fingernails are gone. This is not a soldier anymore. It is a husk. He crawls toward the basket, woven from palm fronds. Inside lies the treasure, dates, sweet, dark, sticky dates. He shoves a handful into his mouth. He does not chew. He swallows them whole, choking on the pits and the grit. Around him, a dozen other skeletons are doing the same. The sound of animalistic grunts and wet chewing fills the dry air. It should be a moment of salvation. It is a banquet of ghosts. But then, the laughter starts. It begins as a low giggle from the man on the left, and rises to a shrieking cackle that tears his throat. He stands up, swaying like a drunkard in a tavern. He rips open his tunic, sending brass buttons flying into the dust. The heat is absolute, but he is tearing off his clothes, screaming that he is freezing, that the ice is coming. The dates, the gift from the men in the indigo veils, they are not food. They are the key to hell. The man on the ground feels the world tilt sideways. The horizon bends. The black volcanic rocks begin to bleed. His stomach cramps a violent knot that doubles him over. He looks at his hands and sees them melting. The sweet taste in his mouth turns to bitter ash and copper. He tries to scream a warning, but his tongue is swollen too thick for his mouth. Gunshots ring out. Someone is firing at the sun. Someone else is running naked into the wavering heat haze, chasing a mirage of water that does not exist, high above on the ridge. The Tuareg watchers stand motionless. They do not need to draw their swords. They do not need to waste their ammunition. The desert and the madness are doing the work for them. This is how the pride of a nation dies, not with a bang of glory, but with a mouthful of poison and a scream that no one will ever hear. Only weeks ago, these men marched with 300 camels and the arrogance of an empire. Now, they are eating death in the dirt. How did they walk so willingly into the slaughterhouse? To understand the massacre, we must rewind the clock. We must scrub the blood from the sand and replace the screams with the sound of drums. 3 months before the madness began, the expedition left Wargla like a conquering army. It was late 1880. The air was cool and filled with the scent of gunpowder and leather. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Flat Turs rode at the head of a beast that stretched for miles. 300 camels, dozens of French engineers and officers, scores of Shamba riflemen. They were not just men walking into the desert. They were the embodiment of the trans-Saharan railway project, a dream of steel and steam, cutting through the heart of Africa. Flat Turs was 49 years old, a veteran, a man who believed that civilization could tame the wild just by drawing lines on paper. He looked at the vast emptiness and saw a schedule. He saw stations and water towers. In his saddlebag, he carried a letter to his wife. "I am sure of success," he wrote. "We have everything necessary to get through. The Tuareg will not dare to touch us. Read those words again. Taste the arrogance. It is a flavor that history knows well. It is the taste of the Titanic speeding through the dark. It is the taste of Icarus gluing feathers to his arms. For weeks, the desert let them pass. The dunes of the Grand Erg Oriental were like frozen waves of gold. The nights were crisp. The campfire talk was of promotion and glory. They measured the land with their theodolites and wrote down numbers in leather notebooks. But the deeper they went, the more the land changed. The soft sand hardened into the Hamada, a brutal landscape of black gravel and razor-sharp stones. The horizon stopped looking like a line and started looking like a wall. They were entering the Ahaggar, the domain of the Kel Ahaggar, Tuareg, the people of the Vale. Here, the silence was different. It was heavy. It watched them. The Shamba guides grew nervous. They checked their rifles and scanned the ridges. They knew this place. They knew that in the Ahaggar, you are never truly alone. But Flat Turs pressed on. He was chasing a ghost. He needed to find a route for the train. When the Tuareg finally appeared, they did not come with swords. They came with smiles. They came with offers of guidance. They were tall men wrapped in indigo cloth that stained their skin blue. They moved like shadows. This was the moment. The pivot point where history holds its breath. The Tuareg guides suggested a split. The heavy baggage camels should go one way to find easier ground. The main body of the expedition should go another towards the well. It made logistical sense. It was efficient. It was also a lie. A military man should have seen the pincer movement closing. A veteran should have smelled the trap. But Flat Turs saw only the railway. He saw cooperation where he should have seen a knife being sharpened. He gave the order. The column split. The strength was divided. The 300 camels were separated from the rifles. The French officers rode toward the well of Bir el-Garama, thinking of cool water. They were riding into the slaughterhouse. The sun climbed higher. The shadows stretched out like long black fingers, ready to grab them by the throat. The trap was sprung not with a noise, but with a terrifying quiet. The well of Bir el-Garama was not an oasis of green palms and singing birds. It was a scar in the earth, a muddy depression surrounded by black volcanic rock and tufts of dry scorched grass. On the 16th of February, 1881, the expedition halted here. The air was thick with the smell of wet fur and dung. The camels were desperate. They shoved and groaned, pressing their long necks toward the brown water. It was a scene of chaos, but it was the chaos of life. Men laughed. They splashed water on their burning faces. They unbuckled their belts and let their guards down because the hardest part of the day was over. They believed the water was a reward. They did not see that it was a lure. Colonel Flat Turs sat on his horse watching the animals drink. He was tired. The dust of the Ahaggar had worked its way into the lines of his face. He looked at the Tuareg guides who had led them here. They stood in a circle, slightly apart from the French and the Shamba riflemen. They were silent statues, wrapped in indigo cloth. Their eyes were invisible behind the litham veils, but they were not watching the water. They were watching the rifles that had been carelessly leaned against the rocks. They were watching the officers who had wandered away to inspect the terrain. The trap was set. The jaws were open. And then the desert exploded. There was no bugle call, no declaration of war. Just a sudden, terrifying ululation that sounded like a scream from the throat of the earth itself. The statues came to life. The blue robes blurred into motion. Before a single French soldier could reach for a weapon, the air was filled with the hiss of iron. Tuareg spears, long and heavy, punched through uniforms and flesh. The sound of the ambush was the wet thud of metal hitting bone. It was intimate violence. There was no distance of a gunshot. It was breath on face, and eyes staring into eyes. Flat Turs turned his horse, but he was already a ghost. He never drew his saber. A rush of attackers swarmed him, pulling him from the saddle like wolves taking down a stag. He fell into the dust, and the history books say he died instantly. Captain Mass tried to rally the men, but a sword stroke silenced him. In less than 5 minutes, the command structure of the mission was decapitated. The sand around the well turned into a red slurry. The camels panicked, trampling the wounded and snapping their tethers. The beasts stampeded into the open desert, taking the water skins and the ammunition with them. The survivors were not soldiers anymore. They were prey. The Shamba riflemen fired wildly into the melee, their shots echoing uselessly off the canyon walls. Panic took hold. It was a primal scramble for survival. They retreated from the well, backing away from the water they so desperately needed. They ran toward the rocky slopes, leaving the bodies of their commanders to the flies. As the sun began to dip lower, casting long red shadows across the massacre, the noise finally died down. The Tuareg did not pursue them immediately. They did not have to. They held the water. They held the camels. They held the food. From the safety of the high rocks, the shivering remnants of the expedition looked down. They saw their enemies moving among the corpses, stripping them of boots and weapons. They saw the Tuareg slaughtering the camels that had not run away, feasting on fresh meat while the French watched with empty bellies. The silence returned, but it was heavier now. It was the silence of a tomb. The survivors checked their pockets. They had a few handfuls of grain. They had a few cartridges, and they had 300 miles of burning hell between them and the nearest outpost. The first blood had been spilled, but the real horror was not the quick death of the sword. The real horror was the slow death that was waiting for them in the tomorrow. The retreat began not as a march, but as a stumble. There were no bugles to sound the withdrawal, only the dry rasp of dying breath. 60 men turned their backs on the slaughter at el-Garama and faced the north. Ahead of them lay 300 miles of the most hostile terrain on the planet. They had no water skins. They had no tents to shield them from the hammer of the sun. They had only the clothes on their backs and a few terrified camels that had survived the massacre. The desert did not care about their rank or their uniforms. The desert saw only water sacks made of flesh walking on 2 legs, and it began the slow process of draining them dry. Hunger is not a feeling. It is a creature. It lives inside the belly, and it wakes up when the food stops coming. For the first few days, they ate the camels. They did not roast the meat because there was no wood for fires. They ate it raw. They tore into the warm muscle with their teeth, the blood staining their beards and stiffening in the heat. It was primal. A French officer who had once dined on porcelain plates in Paris was now on his knees fighting a Shamba guide for a strip of raw sinew. Civilization fell away like a scab. When the meat was gone, they cracked the bones and sucked out the marrow. When the marrow was gone, they boiled the hide. They cut pieces from their own boots and chewed on the leather, trying to trick their stomachs into silence. The sun became a physical weight. It pressed down on their shoulders with the force of gravity. Their lips cracked and bled, and the blood dried into black crusts. Their tongues swelled until they filled their mouths like gags. Men began to hallucinate. One soldier stopped and pointed at a rock, insisting it was a cafe in Algiers. He sat down to wait for a waiter who would never come, and the column left him there. To stop was to die. The Tuareg were always there. They were shadows on the ridges. They were silhouettes against the blinding white sky. They did not attack. They did not need to. They simply watched as the desert did their work for them. They were the vultures waiting for the carcass to stop twitching. As the days blurred into a nightmare loop of heat and exhaustion, the bodies of the men began to revolt. Scurvy set in. Old wounds reopened as the scar tissue dissolved. Teeth loosened in receding gums. The skin turned a sickly gray and pulled tight over the skull until every man looked like a death mask. They were rotting while they were still walking. The smell of the column was the smell of a morgue left out in the sun. It was the stench of unwashed bodies, and gangrene, and fear. They walked in a trance, one foot, then the other. If a man fell, he was stripped of his clothes and his rifle before his heart stopped beating. There was no sentimentality left. There was only the math of survival. Then came the hunger that logic could not control. The hunger that looked at the corpse of a fallen comrade and saw meat. It started with whispers, dark glances at the fresh dead. The taboo was a wall, but the wall was crumbling. They were not men anymore. They were biological machines desperate for fuel. They drank their own urine to soothe the fire in their throats. They looked at the soft flesh of the dead with a terrible longing. The descent was complete. They had entered a place beyond morality, where the only law was the law of the jaw and the stomach. They were walking through hell, and the devil was starving. The circle closes. We return to the moment where the nightmare began. The narrative loop tightens around the throat of the expedition. It is late March now. The survivors have been walking for weeks. They are not a military unit. They are a scattered line of dying animals, leaving a trail of rags and bones across the Hamada. The sun is no longer an enemy. It is a god that demands sacrifice. The remaining French officers are dragging themselves forward by sheer will. Their boots are gone. Their feet are wrapped in strips of uniform that are fused to the skin by dried blood and pus. They do not speak. To speak is to waste moisture. Then the shadows return. The Tuareg appear on the horizon like a mirage. They do not attack with swords this time. They know the game is over. They know that hunger is a sharper blade than any steel. They approach with baskets. The weave of the palm fronds is tight and intricate. Inside lie the dates. We saw this moment at the beginning, but now we understand the weight of it. We understand the desperation that makes a man ignore the warning bells in his mind. The survivors fall upon the food. They shove the sweet, sticky fruit into mouths that have chewed only leather and raw camel meat for days. The poison takes hold. The Henbane, the Hi-O Sai A Musfa Les. It does not kill them instantly. It breaks the final lock on their sanity. The scene is a tableau of the grotesque. Men who once discussed engineering and cartography are now rolling in the hot grit, howling at the sky. They tear at their own flesh. They fire their rifles at the sun until the hammers click on empty chambers. The Tuareg watch. They stand motionless in their indigo robes, witnesses to the total disintegration of the European mind. The desert absorbs the screams. The wind carries the sound away, leaving only the silence of the rocks. When the madness fades, the true horror begins. The survivors wake up from their delirium to find that the hunger is back, and it is worse than before. The group has fractured. The distinction between officer and guide, between colonizer and colonized, has evaporated. There is only meat. The weaker members of the party, those who fell during the drug-induced frenzy, are not mourned. They are butchered. The knives come out not for defense, but for harvest. It is the ultimate taboo, and it is broken with a terrifying efficiency. The last French officer falls. He does not get up. He looks at the Shamba guides expecting help, expecting the loyalty that the Empire promised. But the Empire does not exist here. The map is blank. The guides look back at him, and they do not see a commander. They see calories. They see another day of life. They leave him. Or perhaps they do not leave him. The history books are polite about the details, but the desert keeps its secrets. The expedition is effectively dead. What remains is a small pack of hardened survivors moving north, driven by a biological imperative so strong it overrides the soul. They leave the bones of the mission behind, bleaching in the sun. They walk away from the wreckage of their humanity, leaving footprints that the wind will erase by nightfall. The climax is not a battle. It is a meal. It is the silence that follows the feast. It is the realization that civilization is a thin coat of paint, and the desert has sandblasted it all away. The date is April 4th, 1881. The gates of the fortress at Wargla stand closed against the driving wind. Inside the mud brick walls, life follows the rhythm of the garrison. Soldiers polish their boots. Merchants haggle over grain. They are waiting for the return of the heroes. They are waiting for the triumph of the trans-Saharan railway. The sentries on the parapet squint into the blinding white horizon. They are looking for the dust cloud of 300 camels. They are looking for the tricolor flag snapping in the breeze. Instead, they see ghosts. A small cluster of figures emerges from the heat haze. They are not marching. They are lurching. They stumble forward with the erratic gait of the broken. There are 12 of them, just 12. They are not the conquering army that left 3 months ago. They are biological wreckage. Their bodies are skeletal frames wrapped in skin that looks like cured tobacco. They are naked or draped in rags that were once uniforms. As they draw closer, the silence on the walls becomes absolute. The sentries lower their rifles. They recognize the faces beneath the grime. These are the Shamba guides, the hired help. But where are the masters? Where are the white pith helmets? Where is the gold braid of the Republic? Where is Lieutenant Colonel Paul Flat Turs? The answer is written in the hollow stares of the survivors. It is written in the way they flinch at the sound of a voice. No Frenchmen return? Not one. The desert has eaten the leadership of the expedition whole. The officers are gone. The engineers are gone. They are scattered piles of bones bleaching in the sun, hundreds of miles to the south. They are dust mixing with the black volcanic rock of the Aha-Gar. The grand dream of connecting Algiers to the Sudan with steel and steam has ended in a nightmare of cannibalism and madness. The survivors are brought inside, but they bring the horror with them. They speak in whispers of the poison dates. They speak of the nights where the living looked at the dead and saw only food. The medical reports are a catalog of devastation. Stomachs shrunk to the size of fists. Minds shattered by trauma that no doctor can heal. The investigation is a formality. The verdict is already carved into the landscape. The mission did not fail because of a lack of ammunition or water. It failed because of hubris. It failed because a man looked at a map and thought his will was stronger than the geography. The legacy of the Flat Turs mission is not a railway station. It is a warning. It becomes a ghost story told in the mess halls of the Foreign Legion. It is a reminder that the map is not the territory. The desert does not care about your rank. It does not care about your technology or your ambition. It waits. It watches. It is patient. The railway project is abandoned, buried under the same sand that covered the bodies of the expedition. It will be decades before the engine of progress dares to challenge the silence of the Sahara again. As the sun sets over Wargla, the wind picks up. It howls through the palm trees and scratches against the city gates. It sounds like the hiss of a sword leaving a scabbard. It sounds like the laughter of the Tuareg watchers on the high ridges. The story of the men who ate each other ends here. But the desert remains, huge, indifferent, and hungry.